Cheppy, France. The morning of September 26, 1918. Fog sat low over Hill 78, thick enough that men 20 feet apart lost sight of each other. And somewhere inside that fog, a 32-year-old cavalry officer turned tank commander was doing something he had been explicitly ordered not to do. He had left his command post. He was walking forward, on foot, into the opening hour of the largest offensive the American Army had ever launched, because the reports reaching him said his tanks were stuck, his infantry had lost its officers, and he did not trust a radio message to tell him the truth of what mud and machine guns were doing to the men he had spent the last year building from nothing. Within the hour, a German bullet would put him on the ground. What his orderly did in the next 60 minutes would earn that orderly the nation's second highest award for valor. And what the wounded officer did from inside a shell hole, refusing every reasonable argument for being carried off that field, would tell you more about the general he was about to become than almost anything that happened to him in the war that made him famous. If you want the real, documented history behind the man before Sicily, before the Bulge, before the ivory-handled revolvers, this channel exists to tell it the way it actually happened, sourced and verifiable. Stay with this one. The ending involves a friendship that would resurface 14 years later, in a country his own government sent him to police, under circumstances neither man could have imagined lying in that shell hole. To understand what Patton was doing on that hill, you have to go back about a year, to a captain nobody outside a small circle of cavalry officers had any reason to know. In the fall of 1917, George Patton was 31 years old, a captain commanding the headquarters company of the American Expeditionary Force at Chaumont, and by his own count, 113th on the list of cavalry officers eligible for promotion. That number mattered to him more than he liked to admit. A career built entirely on horseback was a career moving at the pace of every other cavalry officer's career, and Patton had never been a man comfortable moving at anyone else's pace. When Lieutenant Colonel Leroy Eltinge, a mentor of his on Pershing's staff, asked whether he'd consider becoming a tank officer, in a tank corps that at that point consisted of paperwork and a single unbuilt idea, most cavalry officers of Patton's generation would have treated the offer as a demotion in everything but name. Tanks were untested, unglamorous, and mechanically embarrassing more often than not. Patton said yes almost immediately. He spoke passable French, which mattered more than you'd think for an American officer about to spend the rest of the war coordinating with French tank designers and French tank instructors. He'd shown real mechanical aptitude the previous year in Mexico, where he'd led one of the U.S. Army's first attacks by motor vehicle against a group of Pancho Villa's men, an engagement barely worth a footnote in most histories of Patton's career, but the kind of detail that told Eltinge exactly what he needed to know about whether this particular cavalry captain could be trusted around an engine. On the 10th of November, 1917, Patton was officially assigned to build an American tank corps essentially from scratch. He was, at that point, the only tank soldier the United States Army had. There was no school, there was no manual, there were no tanks. What there was a report Patton wrote with a young artillery lieutenant named Elgin Brain, after the two of them spent 2 weeks at the French Light Tank Training Center at Chamloo, learning to drive, maintain, and fire a machine neither of them had ever touched before arriving. The two armies who had actually used tanks in this war did not agree on what they were for. The British had built heavy, slow, and lumbering machines meant to smash a path directly through fortified lines ahead of the infantry, a doctrine of brute breakthrough. The French had gone the other direction entirely, building the lighter, faster Renault specifically to work alongside infantry, filling the gaps where advancing troops got bogged down rather than leading a frontal assault on their own. Patton toured the Renault factory at Billancourt to understand the French approach firsthand. He also traveled to Albert, 30 miles from Cambrai, where the British had just launched an unprecedented mass tank offensive, and was personally briefed on the results by the Chief of Staff of the British Tank Corps. He studied both doctrines, sided philosophically with the French model of speed and flexibility over British mass and weight, and came home from that education tour to produce, with brain, a 58-page report so thorough that Pershing's staff accepted it without a single revision, using it to stand up the Army's first light tank school at a village called Bourg, just south of Langres. Building the school meant building an identity for men who had nothing else to hold on to. Before he could teach anyone else, Patton had spent 2 weeks at the French training center, essentially becoming a student again. At 31 years old, driving the awkward, underpowered Renault over broken ground, firing its single machine gun from a cramped 2-man turret, and by every account enjoying himself enormously in the process. A captain who had spent his whole career on horseback, discovering he had a genuine feel for a machine that most cavalry officers of his generation regarded with open contempt. He designed the Tank Corps' first insignia himself, a triangle in red, yellow, and blue, representing the artillery, cavalry, and infantry branches all folding into this strange new weapon. And when the Army was slow to produce the patches, Patton paid out of his own pocket to have 300 of them sewn locally in Langres. Long before he had a single working tank to his name, he had made sure his men had something stitched onto their shoulders that told them they belonged to something specific. The first 10 Renault FT tanks did not arrive until the 23rd of March, 1918, more than 4 months after Patton's assignment began. He was, by that point, the only American soldier in the unit who actually knew how to drive one, and when the train carrying them pulled in, Patton personally got behind the controls and drove 7 of the 10 off the flat cars himself. The tank had no radio. Coordination between a tank commander standing in the open turret and the driver below him happened through a code of kicks against the driver's shoulders and back. A kick square in the spine meaning forward, a kick to the left shoulder meaning turn left, to the right meaning turn right. This was the machine, and this was the method that Patton spent the spring of 1918 teaching to infantry officers who mostly regarded the whole project with open skepticism. By June, he had enough men trained to stand up a 2nd Light Tank Battalion, and Patton took command of the full brigade. Word reached him in August that the theory was about to become a battlefield. Rockenbach, the officer now commanding the whole American Tank Corps, made sure there would be real armor on the ground for the coming offensive at Saint-Mihiel. 3 heavy battalions training in England, contributing 150 British tanks, 3 French brigades contributing 225 of their own light Renaults, alongside Patton's own American crude battalions. On the 12th of September, at Saint-Mihiel, Patton's brigade put 144 Renault tanks into action for the first time, 1 battalion supporting the 1st Division and 1 supporting the 42nd, in an offensive that pushed the German salient back in a matter of days, with relatively light American losses. It worked. Not perfectly, not without tanks bogging down in the churned mud of no man's land, but well enough that Patton came out of Saint-Mihiel convinced that everything he'd built over the previous 10 months, the school with no tanks, the report Pershing's staff hadn't touched, the patches he'd paid for himself, had been worth building. 2 weeks later, at Meuse-Argonne, the same tanks and the same doctrine would be tested against an enemy who had learned exactly what to do about them. The fog on the morning of the 26th of September made everything slower and more uncertain than Saint-Mihiel had been. The ground near Chepi was already chewed up from years of static warfare, soft and cratered in a way that swallowed a 5-mile-an-hour tank almost as easily as a foot soldier's boots. Patton had established his command post to the rear, the place a brigade commander was supposed to be during the opening hour of a major offensive, receiving reports and issuing orders through the chain of command, the way doctrine and common sense both required. The reports that reached him were not good. Tanks were stuck. Infantry officers, in the specific chaos of fog and artillery fire that defines the first hour of any offensive, were being killed or wounded faster than the men under them could adjust, leaving entire platoons without anyone to tell them what to do next. Patton made a decision at his command post that morning that no manual would have endorsed. He left it. He went forward on foot, in the fog, toward Hill 78, because he did not trust second-hand reports to tell him what was actually happening to the brigade he had spent nearly a year building from a report nobody had bothered to revise. What he found, when he reached the forward positions, was close to the situation the reports had described, and worse, in the specific ways that only direct observation reveals. The fog had not lifted. Visibility ran to perhaps 20 or 30 yards in places, enough to see a shape moving, and not enough to know immediately whether it wore the right uniform. Tanks were mired to their hulls in mud that no amount of engine power could climb out of, engines screaming against tracks that had simply stopped translating into forward motion. Infantrymen who had lost their officers were doing what leaderless infantry under fire tends to do, holding position out of uncertainty rather than advancing out of orders, which in the middle of an offensive amounts to the same thing as retreating. Patton did what a cavalry officer with more nerve than sense does in that situation. He started rounding up the leaderless men himself, organizing them by voice and presence rather than rank structure, pointing them toward the objective, working simultaneously to get the stuck tanks freed from the mud that was holding them, walking upright between positions where most men were staying low. He was, by any formal definition of the job of a brigade commander, exactly where he was not supposed to be, doing exactly the kind of work a sergeant or a lieutenant was supposed to be doing, in full view of German positions on higher ground that had a clear line down onto the hill. He is reported to have said something to the men near him, in the moment before it happened, about the German gunners not being able to hit him. Whether that is the exact sentence or a version of it sharpened by retelling over the following decades, what happened next did not wait long to answer the question. German machine gun fire was coming from a position close enough that the official citation later written for his rescuer specified the distance. Within 40 meters. A bullet caught Patton in the thigh. He went down in the open, in the mud, roughly 20 yards from the position where his orderly, Private First Class Joe Angelo, had been told to stay with a tank at a crossroad while the rest of the unit pushed up the hill. Angelo did not stay at the crossroad. He went to Patton. He was, by his own account decades later, a man of about 105 pounds, and Patton was closer to 170, and Angelo got his wounded commanding officer onto his shoulders and carried him under continuing fire to a shell hole that offered at least the illusion of cover. He bandaged the wound as best a soldier's field kit allowed. And then, instead of the story ending there, with a wounded commander safely under cover and an orderly having done everything duty could reasonably ask of him, Patton stayed in command. For over an hour, from inside that shell hole, under artillery fire that had not stopped simply because one officer had been hit, Patton continued directing what he could see of the battle, and twice during that hour he sent Angelo back out, into the same fire that had just put a bullet in his thigh, carrying orders to tanks that were passing near enough to reach. Angelo went. Twice. Here's what doesn't usually make it past the basic outline of this story. A wounded brigade commander, bleeding in a shell hole, had every justification available to him to stop giving orders and let the men around him handle what came next. Nobody would have questioned it. He had already broken protocol once that morning by leaving his post to reach the front line in the first place, and he had paid for it. What he chose to do instead, treating a hole in the ground under continuous shell fire as an acceptable substitute for a command post, asking a soldier who had just saved his life to walk back into the same gunfire not once but twice, tells you something about how Patton understood the job of commanding men that no training manual could have taught him. The tanks needed direction. The direction was not going to reach them through any channel except the one currently available, which was a wounded man on the ground and the soldier willing to run messages for him. Patton used what he had. He did not treat his own wound as the end of his usefulness to the men still fighting on that hill. And whatever you think of the wisdom of a commander putting himself in that position in the first place, the discipline required to keep functioning, keep issuing coherent orders, keep prioritizing the battle over his own pain and his own survival, while lying in a hole with a bullet wound in his leg, is not something every officer in that war, or any war, actually had in him when the moment arrived. Angelo received the Distinguished Service Cross for what he did that morning, along with the French Croix de Guerre and the French War Medal, 3 separate nations' worth of gratitude for a single hour of carrying and running messages under fire. The official citation for his award specified exactly what the moment had cost him. Within 40 meters of the German machine guns, carrying his wounded commanding officer into a shell hole, remaining with him under continuous shell fire for over an hour, except when he twice carried orders to passing tanks. Patton recovered from the wound enough to spend the rest of his life carrying a small physical reminder of that morning, along with the professional one. His mother sent Angelo a gold bullet set with a pearl, engraved as a reminder of the bullet that had gone through her son's leg. A strange and specific kind of gift, the sort of thing you send when a thank you card doesn't feel adequate to what actually happened. His wife, Beatrice, sent Angelo an inscribed gift in grateful remembrance of the Argonne, dated to the 26th of September 1918. And the following spring, in an interview that ran in American newspapers, Patton said of the private who had carried him off that hill that he was, without doubt, the bravest man in the American Army. He did not qualify it. He did not share the credit with anyone else in the citation. He said it plainly, and he said it in print, where it would follow both of them for the rest of their lives. Now, here's the thing about what this episode actually reveals. Because it's easy to hear a story about a wound and a rescue and file it under wartime heroics and move on. What Patton did on that hill on the 26th of September was not an isolated act of battlefield courage, disconnected from the rest of his career. It was the first full demonstration, at scale, of a philosophy he would spend the next 27 years refining and imposing on every command he was given. He did not trust second-hand information when first-hand information was available to him, whatever the personal cost of getting it. He treated stalled momentum, a stuck tank, a leaderless platoon, a wounded body, as problems to be worked around rather than conditions to be accepted. And he kept working the problem past the point where accepting the situation would have been the reasonable, defensible, survivable choice. Notice, too, what he didn't do in that shell hole. He didn't spend the hour arguing with anyone about whose fault the stalled advance was. He didn't wait for permission to keep functioning as a commander once he'd technically become a casualty. The job in front of him didn't change just because his body had. That is a specific kind of discipline, separate from the physical courage of walking into machine gun range in the first place, and it is the part of this story that has less to do with bravery than with an almost stubborn refusal to consider himself finished until the situation in front of him was finished. The National WWII Museum's own account of Patton's service puts it plainly. He left the war convinced that speed, aggression, and offensive momentum would define the battlefields of the future. That conviction did not arrive as an abstract military theory he read somewhere between wars. It arrived in a shell hole outside Cheppy, France, forged directly out of the experience of watching stalled tanks and leaderless men lose ground that speed and initiative might have held, and it never left him. 26 years later, an entire army under his command would move across France faster than anyone on either side of that war believed an army could move, and the man giving those orders was the same man who, wounded and bleeding in 1918, had refused to let a hole in his leg be the reason a battle went unsupervised. There's one more piece of this story worth sitting with before we close it out, because it doesn't end in 1918. Joseph Angelo went home from that war with a Distinguished Service Cross, 2 French decorations, and, for a while, whatever quiet gratitude a general's family could offer a man who had carried their son off a battlefield. What Angelo did not go home to was a country that had any particular plan for taking care of veterans who came back with nothing but medals and a service record. 14 years later, in the summer of 1932, in the middle of the Great Depression, Joe Angelo would be standing in Washington, D.C., in a camp full of unemployed veterans, demanding a bonus the government had promised them and had not paid. And the officer sent to clear that camp, on horseback, with cavalry under his command, would be George S. Patton. What happened when the two of them crossed paths again, in circumstances that had almost nothing in common with a shell hole in France, and almost everything in common with the question of what a country owes the men who bleed for it, is not a story with a clean answer. That's the next one. So here's the question worth sitting with about this one instead. Was Patton right to leave his command post that morning, against direct order and against the basic doctrine of where a brigade commander is supposed to be during an offensive, in order to see the situation with his own eyes? The tanks he went to check on really were stuck. The infantry really had lost its officers. His presence on that hill, wounded or not, appears to have helped hold a position that might otherwise have come apart. Some would say the outcome justifies the decision, that a commander who trusts only what he can verify himself is exactly the kind of commander an army needs at the moment things start going wrong, and that the willingness to share the exact risk his men were sharing is what separated Patton from officers content to manage a battle from a map table miles behind the fighting. Others would say that a brigade commander is worth more to his men alive, uninjured, and at his post than he is wounded in a shell hole playing runner traffic for a handful of tanks. That the entire chain of command exists precisely so that one man's instinct to see things for himself doesn't leave an entire brigade one lucky German bullet away from losing its commanding officer in the war's opening hour. And that Patton got away with a decision that, on a different morning, with a slightly different bullet, would have cost the offensive far more than a wound to the thigh. Both readings survive contact with the same set of facts, the same fog, the same shell hole, the same hour of orders shouted from the mud. Neither one changes what actually happened on that hill, or what it turned Patton into for the rest of his career. If you want the real story of what happened when Patton and Joe Angelo met again in 1932, subscribe, and let me know in the comments whether you think a commander belongs at the front with his men, or behind the line with his maps.